In this video, we'll talk about consumer and producer surplus. Now, let's start with consumer surplus. When we look at a demand curve, guys, demand curve is downward sloping, which means that when the price of a good goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. And sometimes it happens when the demand curve is downward sloping that the price that we are willing to pay is more than the price that we actually pay. For example, let's say the price in the market for a good is $5. Okay, and I'm planning to buy, let's say, 5 units of it. Now, it could be possible that when I look at the first unit, I give it a lot of value. And let's say, although the price is $5, but I'm willing to pay all the way like $9. Now, remember this, guys. What is our demand curve telling us? Just a recap of a concept that our demand curve tells us what we are willing to pay. So, all of these points on the demand curve shows us what we are willing and able to pay. But what we actually pay is a function of where the demand meets supply. So for example, if I let's say draw my supply curve here, then this would mean my equilibrium is at $5, which is what the producer is asking. For discussion today, let's just remove the supply curve to make things simple, and let's assume that $5 is my market price. So market price is $5. And so what I'm saying is this: when I decided to buy the first unit of this good, uh, my willingness to pay was $9, because let's assume I really like this good. This could be your first slice of pizza, and I'm really hungry, and I'm willing to pay $9. But the producer is only asking for $5, which would mean that what I'm willing to pay is more than what I actually pay. And when we are willing to pay more than what we actually pay, this is good news for a consumer, because that would mean his welfare will go up. He is actually pocketing what we call a consumer surplus for the first unit. So for the first unit, he pocketed a consumer surplus, which is the difference between what he is willing to pay. Let me write this: willing to pay minus what he actually pays. Okay, so what he's willing to pay for the first unit was, for example, 9. What he actually paid was 5, which would mean he pocketed $4 for the first unit, which is great news because he wanted to pay more, but the producer was only asking for $5, which means he's pocketing $4. For the second unit, guys, let's assume now that I've consumed the first unit, I'm not that hungry anymore, but I'm still wanting to have the second slice. And I know this, one of the rules of why the demand curve is downward sloping is the diminishing marginal utility, which says this: that when you consume more and more of a unit, your willingness to pay goes down because you are satisfied, and so your satisfaction goes down, so you are not willing to pay as much as you were willing to pay before. So let's say for the second unit, I'm willing to pay $8. Okay, so my willingness to pay has gone down because this is not the first unit, this is my second unit. So but the producer is still asking for $5 because that's the market price, which means for the second unit I am having what we call a consumer surplus of $3. Why? Because I am willing to pay more still than the price the producer is asking. But let's say this goes on, and for the third unit, for example, I'm willing to pay a little less, let's say 7, and for the fourth one, I'm willing to pay, for example, 6. That would mean if I fill this table up for the fourth and the fifth unit, I am I am going to have a situation where we are looking at, for the third unit it is 7, for the fourth unit it is 6, and for the fifth unit it is 5. So my willingness to pay is going down as I go from 9, as I go from the first to the second to the third to the fourth and the fifth unit. But the market price stays at $5 because that's what the producer has decided. Now, what I do in this process is that every time I consume a good where my consumer surplus is more than the where my willingness to pay is more than the what I'm actually paying, I am pocketing a consumer surplus, which means 7 minus 5 is 2, 6 minus 5 is 1, 5 minus 5 is 0. Now, what is happening, guys, in this process is that all of this is the extra consumer surplus that I'm pocketing. But let's say, what happens at the sixth unit? Will you consume the sixth unit? And the answer is no, you won't, because now, if you look closely, let's call this point X, that the market price is 5, But for the sixth unit, somewhere here, my willingness to pay will be less, let's say $4. Will I ever buy a good where the willingness to pay is less than the market price, or what I'm required to pay? And the answer is no. I will never be willing to pay. I will never be buying a good where my willingness to pay is less than what I actually pay. So I will never buy the sixth unit. Let's say six one is has a willingness to pay of 4, but the market price is 5, which means my consumer surplus for the sixth unit is -1. I will never want to have a situation where my consumer surplus is negative. What this means is this, that the difference between what I'm willing to pay and what I actually pay, we actually call that as our marginal or extra consumer surplus. Why? Because it is telling us the consumer surplus for each and every unit. And since I will not buy a good where the consumer surplus is negative, why? Because I will be like, you know what, for this good, let me cancel it out. For this good, the sixth unit is where I'm not willing to pay $5. My value for the good is only $4. So I stop at that point, which would mean my point of stopping is when I'm willingness to pay is equal to what I actually pay, or my marginal consumer surplus is 0. And that would mean that I will be pocketing all of this amount. So if I add all of this amount, 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 plus 0, I will get my total consumer surplus, and that total consumer surplus will turn out to be 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, that's 3 plus 3 6 plus 4 is 10. I pocketed $10 of consumer surplus. Now that basically means all of this area under the demand curve above the market price is what I call my consumer surplus. So what is consumer surplus in terms of area? Consumer surplus by definition is, by the way, amount we are willing to pay minus amount we actually pay, right? And that in turn would mean area under the demand curve but above the market price. So all of this area under the demand curve but above the market price is what I call my consumer surplus, and that is basically good news for the consumer because that is telling us what he's willing to pay minus what he actually paid. Now sometimes we need to know what you're willing to pay in terms of area, so I want to talk about that too. So let's call these O, Y, and this already is X. Let me just zoom on this one. O, Y, X, and let's call this Q as the total area under the demand curve. Now O, X, Y, or rather O, Y, X, Q is what I call my willingness to pay, because I am buying 5 units and I am willing to pay all the area under the demand curve, because each and every point that you can see on the demand curve is telling us what I'm willing to pay, right? So all of this O, Y, X, Q is what I'm willing to pay. Now O, P, X, Q is what I actually pay. In other words, that's the total expenditure or total revenue. You would agree with me as well, because OPXQ is what I am I'm actually paying, or price times quantity, 5 times 5 or $25 is what I'm actually paying for these 5 units. And that's why OYXQ minus OPXQ is what my total consumer surplus will look like, which is going to be PYX. So my consumer surplus, therefore, is my consumer, or my as a consumer, it's my well-being, and it's where I am actually better off because what I'm willing to pay is more than what I actually pay, and that turns out to be a benefit for the consumer, and that is why whenever we buy a good, if we ever have a situation where I'm willing to pay more, we never end up telling the producer, hey, I'm willing to pay more, so how about you take not $5 but $6, but we quietly accept that deal and feel happy about it, because that's where we are actually increasing our welfare. Now, there are a couple of scenarios which can make the consumer surplus to change. And I want to discuss one of the scenarios. One scenario that is important to understand is what I call our price. What if I tell you guys the price of a good goes down? Now, let's say this is the demand curve, right? And let's say the price is P1 and I'm buying quantity Q1. Now, suddenly what happens? Price of a good goes down. And let's also label this as O. Let's call this X, Y, Q1. So currently, right now, my consumer surplus, as we discussed earlier, is X, Y, P1. Okay. Now, what if the price goes down to P2? So let's say due to some reason in demand supply, price goes down to P2 and the quantity goes up. If the price goes down to P2 and the quantity goes up, that means there is a rise in consumer surplus. Why? Because now look at what is happening, guys. The consumer surplus was XYP1. Suddenly price goes down to P2. Now the consumer surplus will be, let's call this consumer surplus 1. Consumer surplus 2 will be now X, let's call this Z. Z P2, which means my change in consumer surplus or rise in consumer surplus will be this trapezium. This trapezium will be my rise in consumer surplus, and that will be equal to P1, P2, or rather P1, let's call this YZ P2. So when the price goes down, consumer surplus will go up. And it makes sense, because when the price goes down, you are now getting a better deal, so your willingness to pay is the same, but your price has gone down, so every unit you're pocketing more consumer surplus. So the lower the price, let's write this, the lower the price, the higher the consumer surplus. Okay, and so that's the one factor. The second factor, of course, is something to do with elasticity of demand, which is something which I'm going to save it for later, because that requires us for us to know elasticity. So when we do elasticity, we'll discuss how elasticity and consumer surplus is also related to each other.